The decree was delivered on October 29th, 1888, a day of brittle blue skies and a wind that carried the first true premonition of winter. It was read aloud on the steps of the Prospects Hollow Town Hall by Mr. Alden himself, a man whose piety was exceeded only by his rigid adherence to bylaws of his own interpretation. The document, citing Municipal Code 17, subsection C, declared that a property held by a widow without male issue or guardian reverted to township control if deemed unmanaged or at risk of neglect. Elara Vance stood before him, a solitary figure in a crowd of murmuring townsfolk. She did not flinch. The wind pressed her worn wool dress against her slender frame, but her posture remained as unyielding as the granite peaks that encircled the valley. She was 17 years old. Her husband Daniel had been dead for 4 months, his life claimed by a falling fir tree in a logging accident that had left her with a small, mortgaged cabin, a set of his tools, and a silence that filled every corner of her life. "The council has determined," Mr. Alden continued, his voice projecting a sense of regrettable but necessary authority, "that the Vance property, given the impending hardships of the season, falls under this provision. It is for your own safety, young lady." A lie, and they all knew it. The true reason was the stand of mature pine on the northern edge of her plot, timber the town council coveted for its own winter reserves. Her cabin, small but soundly built by Daniel's own hands, was simply an obstacle. She was an inconvenience to be swept aside. She was given 48 hours to vacate. She would be permitted to take her personal effects, Daniel's tools, and the remaining cords of firewood she and her husband had painstakingly cut and stacked throughout the summer. As a final act of what he termed Christian charity, Mr. Alden granted her title to a forgotten parcel of land a half-mile outside the town's edge. It was a steep, south-facing hillside, considered worthless for farming or building, a place where only scrub oak and wild grasses grew between rocky outcroppings. She was also given the sum of $47 in silver coins, the council's official purchase price for her home and land. She did not argue. She did not plead. To do so would have been to give them a satisfaction they did not deserve. Instead, she met Mr. Alden's gaze with an unnerving placidity, nodded once, and turned to walk back to the cabin she would soon no longer call home. The crowd parted for her, their pity and morbid curiosity a palpable force. Not one of them offered help. Not one of them spoke out against the clear injustice. They were mountain folk, accustomed to hardship, but also deeply suspicious of anyone who deviated from the established order. Elara, an orphan who had married into the community, had always been an outsider. Now, she was an outcast. For 2 days, she worked with a methodical fury. She loaded the buckboard wagon Daniel had built, piling it with her meager possessions: a cast-iron skillet, 2 blankets, a small crate of tinned goods, her sewing kit, and Daniel's tools. The toolbox was a heavy oaken chest containing an axe, a broadaxe, a saw, a froe, a draw knife, an adze, and a set of augers. These were her true inheritance. Finally, she loaded the firewood. It was her lifeblood, 3 full cords of seasoned pine and oak, each piece a memory of a day spent working alongside her husband. As she lifted the last log, she felt a profound and chilling sense of solitude. The wood was all she had to see her through the coming cold. On the morning of November 1st, she guided the old mare Bess away from the cabin. She did not look back. Her destination was the worthless hillside, her new home. When she arrived, the wind was sharper, slicing across the barren slope. She stood for a long time, surveying the land. The townsfolk saw a useless patch of dirt. Elara saw something else. She saw the perfect southern exposure, the natural drainage of the slope, and the protection offered by a granite ledge at the crest of the hill. She saw potential, not as the town understood it, but as her grandfather had taught her. Her grandfather had not been a mountain man. He had been a plainsman from the wind-swept grasslands of the Dakotas, a place where timber was scarce and the wind was a relentless enemy. He had built his homes not by going up, but by going down. He had taught her the principles of the earth itself, of its unyielding thermal mass, its ability to store the sun's warmth and deflect the winter's cold. He called his structures earth lodges, and they were warm in the winter and cool in the summer, a concept entirely alien to the log cabin orthodoxy of Prospect's Hollow. Her plan was audacious, born of desperation and ancestral knowledge. She would not build a cabin. She would dig a home. She would create a structure that was more a part of the hill than an imposition upon it. A long, low dwelling dug into the earth, with a glazed southern face to drink in the low winter sun, and a roof of earth and sod to insulate it from the crushing cold. It would be, in essence, a pit house, a human burrow, a walipini. The townsfolk, she knew, would call it a grave. The work began that same day. She marked out the dimensions with stakes and twine, a long rectangle oriented east to west to maximize the southern exposure. The planned interior space was to be 12 feet wide and 24 feet long. The excavation would be 8 feet deep at the back, north-facing wall, and slope up to a depth of 6 feet at the front, south-facing wall. This was not merely digging a hole. It was a feat of engineering and monumental physical labor. For the first week, her world shrank to the bite of the shovel, the heft of the pickaxe, and the rhythmic ache in her back and shoulders. The topsoil was thin, but it gave way to a dense, clay-like substrate mixed with shale and stone. Each shovelful was a victory. She worked from sunup to sundown, fueled by cold bread and a fierce, quiet determination. She piled the excavated earth meticulously, separating the topsoil, the clay subsoil, and the larger rocks into distinct mounds. These were not waste materials. They were her building blocks. It was during the second week of this arduous labor that she received her first visitors. Mr. Alden, accompanied by Thomas Finch, the town's master carpenter, and Silas Croft, a farmer whose family had worked the valley soil for 3 generations, rode up the track to her site. They sat atop their horses, looking down at her in the pit she had dug, which was now nearly 3 feet deep. "Good heavens, child," Mr. Alden began, his tone a practiced blend of concern and condescension. "What is the meaning of this? Are you digging a well?" Ilara paused, resting one hand on the handle of her shovel. She wiped a smear of dirt from her brow with the back of her other hand, leaving a muddy streak. "I am building my home, Mr. Alden," she said, her voice even and devoid of emotion. Thomas Finch let out a short, derisive laugh. He was a man who understood the world through the language of mortise and tenon, of dovetail joints and perfectly squared beams. The raw, earthen scar in the hillside was an affront to his craft. "A home? That's a root cellar, girl. Or maybe a grave you're digging for yourself before the snow flies. You can't live in a hole in the ground." "The ground is warmer than the air in winter," Ilara stated simply. It was a fundamental principle of thermodynamics, a truth as old as the earth itself. Silas Croft, the farmer, shook his head, his expression one of profound pity. "That ain't how it works. That's damp earth. It'll suck the heat right out of you. You'll catch your death of consumption before the first real blizzard. The ground freezes, girl. It freezes solid, 4 feet deep in a hard winter." "It freezes from the top down," Ilara countered, her patience wearing thin. "Below the frost line, the earth maintains a constant temperature, around 50 degrees. It is a source of heat, not a drain." Her grasp of the scientific principle only seemed to amuse them more. They saw it as the nonsensical babbling of a young woman unhinged by grief and hardship. It was book knowledge, disconnected from the hard-won, practical wisdom of the mountains. In Prospect Hollow, a proper home was made of logs, with a steep-pitched roof to shed the snow and a great stone hearth to fight back the cold. Anything else was folly. "You have your firewood," Mr. Alden said, gesturing toward the neat stacks she had covered with a canvas tarp. "But you will need 4 walls and a proper roof to burn it under. This is madness. I urge you, for your own good, abandon this project. There are families in town who would take you in as a hired girl for the winter." The offer was the final insult. To trade her independence, however precarious, for servitude, to become a ward of the very council that had dispossessed her. "I thank you for your concern, gentlemen," she said, her voice now edged with ice. "But I will see this through. I suggest you tend to your own preparations for the winter." She turned her back on them then, and drove the shovel into the earth with a resounding thud. It was a clear dismissal. They lingered for another moment, murmuring amongst themselves about a woman's stubbornness and folly, before turning their horses and riding away. Their visit, and the story they would tell back in town, solidified her status. She was no longer just the outcast. She was the madwoman on the hill, digging her own tomb. Their scorn did nothing but fuel her resolve. The excavation deepened. By the end of the 3rd week, she had reached her target depth. The hole was a precise earthen cavity, its walls remarkably stable due to the clay content of the soil. The floor sloped gently from back to front for drainage. The physical toll was immense. Her hands were a mass of calluses and blisters. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest each morning. But as she stood in the space she had carved from the earth, she felt the first flicker of true hope. The air in the pit was still, protected from the incessant wind, and noticeably warmer than the air at the surface. The principle was sound. Now began the construction phase. She used the largest stones she had excavated to build a low foundation wall, a footer, around the interior perimeter. Then, using a mixture of the clay-rich subsoil, water, and dried grass as a binding agent, she began to build up the east, west, and north walls, a technique known as cob construction. It was slow, laborious work, packing the damp earth mixture by hand, building it up in layers, ensuring each layer was firm before adding the next. This earthen wall, built against the existing earth of the hillside, would serve a dual purpose. It would provide structural integrity and, more importantly, it would create an immense thermal mass. This mass would absorb the sun's heat during the day and radiate it back into the dwelling throughout the night. While the cob walls cured, she turned her attention to the roof, the most unconventional and criticized part of her design. From a dense stand of young birch and willow trees growing near a creek at the bottom of the hill, she harvested 24 straight, healthy saplings, each about 4 inches in diameter at its base. She trimmed them to a uniform length of 14 feet. Using Daniel's draw knife, she painstakingly stripped them of their bark. Back at the site, she dug a shallow trench and filled it with water, laying the saplings in to soak for several days. This made them pliable, able to bend without breaking. Then she constructed a simple form on the ground, a wooden arc with the exact curvature she desired for her roof. One by one, she took the soaked saplings and, using her own body weight and a system of stakes and ropes, bent them around the form. She secured them in their bent shape and left them to dry for a week. When she released them, they held their perfect, arched shape. These were to be her roof trusses, the bones of her Quonset-style hut. Thomas Finch returned during this process, alone this time. He stood at the edge of the pit, arms crossed, a look of utter disbelief on his face as he watched her wrestling a sapling into its curved form. "Twigs," he said, unable to contain his incredulity. "You intend to hold back 5 feet of snow with a roof made of twigs." "An arch is the strongest structural form in nature, Mr. Finch," Ilara replied without looking up from her work. "It distributes weight outward, not downward. These twigs, when placed together and properly braced, will be stronger than the flat-pitched roof on your own workshop." "That's book talk," he scoffed. "There's no substitute for a 10 by 10 ridge beam and proper rafters. I've been building in these mountains for 30 years. I know what the snow can do. It's a heavy, wet snow. It snaps trees in half. It will crush this little basket you're weaving and bury you alive." He shook his head and walked away, more convinced than ever of her insanity. Once the arched trusses were dry, she began to set them in place. She notched them into a heavy log she had placed as a header beam along the top of the 6-foot front wall and anchored their other end into another log set against the 8-foot rear wall. She spaced them 2 feet apart, creating a sturdy, vaulted framework. She then wove smaller, more flexible willow branches between the main trusses, creating a tight lattice, a kind of structural wickerwork. The next step was waterproofing and insulation. This was where her meager funds were spent. She rode the mare into the next town, a full day's journey, where she was not known. At the general store, she purchased 2 large rolls of heavy canvas and a bucket of pine tar. The total cost was $6.87. Returning to her hillside, she began the painstaking process of sealing her structure. She stretched the first layer of canvas tightly over the arched lattice, nailing it securely to the front and rear header beams. Then, using a brush she fashioned from pine needles, she coated the entire canvas surface with a thick, sticky layer of hot pine tar. Over this waterproof membrane, she carefully laid the sod she had saved from the initial excavation, placing the squares grass side down. The root systems would provide a strong, fibrous layer. She packed the sod tightly, filling every gap. Finally, she covered the entire roof with a thick 18-inch layer of the reserved topsoil. She raked it smooth, following the gentle curve of the arches. By the time she was finished, the structure had all but disappeared. It no longer looked like a construction site, but a natural, elongated mound of earth, a seamless part of the hillside. The only evidence of a dwelling was the 12 by 24-foot rectangular opening on the south-facing side. This opening was the final, crucial element. It was the structure's mouth and eyes, its engine for collecting warmth. Daniel had been saving 2 large window sashes, salvaged from an old church, for a greenhouse he had dreamed of building. The glass was old and wavy, but intact. These sashes, along with 2 smaller windows she had removed from her cabin before leaving, were her most prized possessions. She spent 4 days building a sturdy wooden frame within the southern opening. With extreme care, she set the glass panes into the frame, creating a large, angled wall of glass that sloped from the ground up to the 6-foot-high front wall. This glazing was angled at approximately 60 degrees, the optimal angle to catch the low rays of the winter sun. She sealed every seam with a mixture of sawdust and pine pitch, making it airtight. The interior was starkly functional. The floor was packed earth, which she had tamped until it was as hard as stone. Against the solid north wall of earth, she installed a small, efficient potbelly stove, running the stovepipe up through a carefully sealed opening in the roof. A stone and clay collar around the pipe prevented it from coming into contact with any of the wooden lattice. In the far eastern corner, she built a raised sleeping platform out of scrap lumber. But the majority of the space, the entire western half of the dwelling, was dedicated to one thing: the wood. She moved the 3 cords of firewood inside, stacking them neatly against the back and side walls. The wood, her key to survival, was now inside her home, protected from the elements, dry, and ready. The total cash outlay for her new home, a structure that was warm, dry, and fireproof, was $6.87 for the canvas and tar. The rest was built with salvaged materials, her own labor, and the earth itself. She moved in on December 18th, 1888. The first snows had already dusted the high peaks, and the air had a persistent, biting chill. Inside her earth lodge, it was a different world. The silence was profound, the thick earthen walls absorbing all outside sound. The air was cool but not cold, holding steady at the Earth's ambient temperature of 52 degrees. When the sun shone, the effect was astonishing. The great south-facing window acted as a massive solar collector. Sunlight poured into the space, striking the dark earthen floor and the dense rear wall, which absorbed the energy. By midday, the interior temperature would rise to a comfortable 70 degrees without her even lighting a fire. At night, the thermal mass would slowly radiate this stored heat back into the room, preventing the temperature from dropping below 60. She needed only the smallest of fires in the potbelly stove for a few hours in the evening to maintain a comfortable warmth throughout the coldest nights. The townsfolk in Prospect's Hollow, meanwhile, were battening down their hatches in the traditional way. They chinked the logs of their cabins with fresh mud and moss. They piled snow against their foundations for insulation. They laid in stores of salted meat and flour. They looked at their own massive wood piles, stacked high against their outer walls, and felt secure. They spoke of the madwoman on the hill with a mixture of pity and contempt. They imagined her shivering in her damp, dark hole, and some even made wagers on how long it would be before she came crawling back to town, begging for shelter. The first major storm of the season arrived on January 5th. It was a heavy, wet snow that piled up 2 feet deep in the valley. For Alara, it was a blessing. The snow was a blanket, a perfect insulator. It covered her earthen roof, adding to its thermal efficiency. Inside, she was warm and dry, reading by the light of a single candle, the gentle heat from the stove filling the small space. Her woodpile remained perfectly seasoned, untouched by the moisture outside. In town, the storm was a nuisance. The wet snow clung to everything. It soaked into the outer layers of the town's woodpiles. When a hard freeze followed the snow, this moisture turned to ice, encasing the logs. It made the wood difficult to handle and even more difficult to burn, sputtering and smoking in their large, inefficient fireplaces, which devoured cord after cord of wood. Still, it was a typical mountain winter, and no one was unduly alarmed. They had reserves. They were prepared. But what came next was not typical. On the morning of January 12th, the sky turned a strange, bruised shade of gray-yellow. The air became unnaturally still and heavy, and the temperature plummeted. The old-timers felt it in their bones, a deep, primal sense of dread. This was no ordinary storm. This was a blizzard, the kind that became a legend, spoken of for generations. They would later call it the Great White Hurricane. It began not with snow, but with wind, a low, mournful howl from the north that grew steadily into a deafening, demonic shriek. It scoured the valley, picking up the existing snow and turning the air into a blinding, horizontal torrent of white. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero, then 30, then 40. The wind chill was a thing of pure lethality, a force that could freeze exposed flesh in under a minute. Inside her earth lodge, Alara heard the wind as a distant, muted roar. Her home, dug into the hillside and presenting almost no profile to the north wind, was untroubled. The thick layer of earth and snow was a shield of impenetrable armor. The glass of her south-facing window rattled slightly in the most violent gusts, but it held firm. She lit her stove, using only a few small pieces of her precious dry pine, and the interior became a pocket of serene warmth in the heart of the raging storm. She had food, water from melted snow, light, and warmth. She was safe. In Prospect's Hollow, it was apocalypse. The wind, funneled by the mountains, struck the town with the force of a physical blow. It ripped shingles from roofs and tore shutters from their hinges. It forced its way through every crack and crevice in the log cabins, filling them with a fine, suffocating powder of snow. The massive stone chimneys, the pride of their homes, became their undoing. The wind howled down them, extinguishing fires and filling the rooms with choking smoke. Those who managed to keep their fires lit found that the blizzard was consuming their wood at a terrifying rate. A week's worth of wood was gone in a single day. The storm raged for 3 solid days. On the second day, a new horror emerged. The sheer weight of the snow, which had now fallen to a depth of over 8 feet and was being piled into monstrous drifts by the wind, began to test the limits of their construction. The first roof to go was the livery stable, which collapsed with a sound that was swallowed by the storm, killing 3 horses. Then, the roof of Thomas Finch's own workshop, the one with the 10-by-10 ridge beam he had boasted of, groaned under the immense load and imploded, destroying his tools and his livelihood. The greatest crisis, however, was the wood. The community woodpile and the individual stacks beside each home were buried under 15-foot drifts. Those who tried to tunnel to them found the logs frozen together in a solid, unmovable mass, cemented by the ice from the earlier storm. What little wood they had indoors was quickly running out. Families huddled together in a single room, burning furniture to stay alive. The cold was an invasive, relentless predator. It seeped through the log walls. It poured in through the windows. It crept up from the floors. The very structures they had believed to be the pinnacle of safety and tradition had become their frozen traps. On the 4th day, the wind finally began to subside, though the snow continued to fall. A council of desperate men gathered in Mr. Alden's parlor, the only home with a still functioning fireplace, fueled by the remains of his wife's prized piano. Their faces were grim, their lips blue with cold. They had lost 3 souls already, an elderly couple and a young child, victims of the suffocating cold. Many more were sick. They were out of wood. They were out of time. It was Silas Croft, the farmer, who spoke the unspeakable. His voice was hoarse, his pride shattered. "The girl," he whispered. "The girl on the hill." A heavy silence fell over the room. They all knew what he meant. Her structure, buried in the earth, would not have been exposed to the wind. Her roof, if it had not collapsed, would have been insulated by the snow. And her woodpile? Her woodpile was inside. "It's a tomb," Thomas Finch muttered, the words hollow, lacking their earlier conviction. "The roof would have caved. She's dead." "We don't know that," Mr. Alden said slowly, his own certainty eroded by the catastrophe. "We cannot know that for sure." He looked at the faces of the men around him, men he had led for years, and saw only fear and desperation. There is no other hope. It was a suicide mission, but 4 of them volunteered: Alden, Finch, Croft, and a young, strong man named Peterson. They wrapped themselves in every layer of clothing they possessed and ventured out into the surreal, white landscape. The world they had known was gone, buried under a sea of snow. They struggled through waist-deep powder and navigated around drifts that were taller than their houses. The half-mile journey to Alara's land took them nearly 2 hours. They were exhausted, half-frozen, and driven only by the slimmest of hopes. As they crested the final rise, they stopped and stared. They had expected to find nothing, a mere lump in the snow. Instead, they saw it. Through the still falling snow, they saw a faint, rectangular patch of warm, yellow light. It was the window. It was a beacon. It was life. They stumbled down the slope, their legs clumsy with cold and fatigue. Finch reached the door first. It was a simple, solid, plank door she had fashioned, set into the wooden frame of the south-facing wall. He raised a frozen mitten and knocked, the sound absurdly loud in the muffled world. The door swung inward. Ilara stood there, framed by the warm light from within. She was wearing a simple dress, her hair was tied back, and her face was calm. Behind her, the men could see the impossible, a warm, dry, well-lit room. They saw the neat stacks of firewood, a mountain of it, reaching to the ceiling. A small fire glowed cheerfully in the potbelly stove. The air that washed over them from the doorway was a miracle of warmth. She looked at the four men, their beards and eyebrows caked with ice, their faces a mask of suffering and disbelief. She saw Mr. Alden, the man who had cast her out. She saw Thomas Finch, the man who had mocked her twig roof. She saw Silas Croft, the man who had predicted she would freeze in her damp hole. Not one of them had lost a family member in the logging accident. Not one had burned through their wood supply just to stay alive in a proper cabin. And not one, in that initial moment of stunned silence, could admit they had been so profoundly, catastrophically wrong. Ilara did not say, "I told you so." She did not demand an apology. She did not gloat. She simply stepped aside. "Come in," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You were letting the heat out." They shuffled inside, bringing the biting cold with them, but it was quickly swallowed by the gentle, radiant warmth of the earth lodge. They stared around them in stunned silence. The arched ceiling of woven branches was holding firm, a testament to the strength of its design. The air was fresh and dry. It was not a tomb. It was a sanctuary. She gave them hot tea and broth, and they huddled near the stove, the feeling slowly returning to their numb extremities. When they could finally speak, it was Alden who found his voice, a broken and humbled instrument. "We were wrong," he said, the words costing him everything. "We were fools, arrogant fools. There are people dying in town, Miss Vance. Children. We have no wood, no heat." Ilara looked at her woodpile, the fruit of her summer's labor, her sole provision for the winter. Then she looked at the men, the representatives of the town that had wronged her. She thought of the families, the children, who were not responsible for the pride and foolishness of their leaders. She nodded. "I have 2 sleds," she said. "We can load them now." For the rest of that day and all through the next, they worked. Ilara, with her boundless energy, and the 4 humbled men, ferried load after load of her dry, seasoned firewood back to the stricken town. Her small, efficient home had preserved the fuel that their grand, inefficient homes had squandered. The forgotten knowledge of an old plainsman, channeled through the hands of a resilient young woman, was saving the town of Prospects Hollow from its own ignorance. The Great White Hurricane of 1888 broke the town, but it remade it as well. 9 people were lost to the cold. Dozens more suffered from frostbite. But dozens more were saved by the firewood from the earth lodge. When the spring thaw finally came, revealing the full extent of the damage, the town began to rebuild. But they did so with a new and profound humility. Thomas Finch, the master carpenter, spent that summer at Ilara's side, not as a teacher, but as an apprentice. He learned the principles of the arch, of thermal mass, of passive solar design. The new structures in Prospect's Hollow looked different. They were built lower to the ground, with deep foundations, and in some cases were partially sheltered by the earth. No one ever again mocked a home built into a hill. Alara Vance never moved back into the town proper. She remained in her home on the hillside, which became a place of reverence, a testament to wisdom and resilience. She was no longer the outcast, no longer the madwoman. She was the sage, the savior, the woman who had listened to the earth when no one else would. Her vindication was not loud or triumphant, but quiet and absolute, as solid and enduring as the earthen walls of the home that had saved them all.